Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I have a conversation with Aron. Aron is one of my personal friends, but he's also one of the speakers at the Breakwater Festival that I'm helping produce at the end of October. And it was really fun to hear a little more about his story and kind of explore what he hopes to bring to the festival and to this little corner of the internet. So I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions or want more information about the festival or Aron, link is in the description below. Aron, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for having me, Cassidy.
Of course, I'm so excited. We're excited to have you at the festival, but I'm definitely excited to get a chance to talk to you a little bit more and give you a space to tell your story a little bit and talk about your participation with Estuary. So before we get in, who are you for those who don't know you?
Yeah, so my name is, well, in Dutch we say Aron, but I know that in this space people often refer to me as Aron, which is also fine. I am from the Netherlands, and I've been living here basically all my life, with the exception of having lived in Ireland for 1 year. And my parents have lived in South Africa, so I've kind of spent moments of my life there, but I've never lived there.
Okay.
And I'm currently 26 years old. I've studied philosophy, and I'm now teaching philosophy at the University of Utrecht. I'm also a little bit, I'm a musician on the side, though. Like I was a proper musician a couple of years ago, when I was much more into actually trying to record stuff and get consistent gigs going. And now it's become more of a hobby, now that my focus has become philosophy much more. And sort of while teaching, I'm also still interested in potentially furthering my own research. So looking for potential PhD possibilities to perhaps further the ideas that I have myself within the philosophy space. And other than that, I'd say I grew up in a Christian household. So I went to church. We had to go to church until I think age 16, maybe 18. I think 16 was what was expected. And to be very honest, I was kind of done with it by then. So I kind of left the church for a while, and I still I haven't rejoined a church since then, but I've definitely gotten interested in this space, in Christianity, but also in other religions, I'd say, since taking up philosophy and asking these questions again. And that's, I guess, what's something we could talk about today. But that's sort of a brief summary.
Yeah. Well, so the 16, that was a house rule.
Yeah, that was kind of a house rule. It might be 18, but I'm honestly not sure. I think it was 16, if I'm not mistaken. That yes, they wanted us to
give it a
we
good
didn't have
go.
to like it, but we had to go. That was kind of the rule. Yeah.
So what was the things that were sort of losing your interest in church? Was there a part of you that for a while you had a deep interest in it and then it sort of faded out, or?
I'd say that I definitely, when I was much younger, I felt a personal connection with God that was always there, and I always felt a lot of warmth in my household. But I could also tell we had kind of this somewhat I should say maybe graying Protestant church, and those can be super nice, but for me I was definitely losing interest. So I would do I obviously say this with some regret right now, but that I would sit all the way in a corner somewhere in a row above, or in the corner of the church, and maybe sort of just hide behind the walls there. And at some point I got so done with it that I was just listening to music while being in that church. So I think it wasn't like there was a strong break, that there was something that traumatized me. I've always felt very welcomed by Christians and by that church as well. It started boring me. So there was nothing in it for me that I found interesting. But that was not because of a rebellion. I didn't have a strong hardcore atheist phase after that. And there were other ways in which my interest in Christianity was always maintained, even though my participation in church was stopped, was halted there, kind of. Yeah.
And how would you say that manifested? In what ways would that sort of Christianity come out, even though it wasn't something you would claim?
There were I think, a bunch of different areas. So first of all, like as I mentioned, I was a musician. I am a musician, and one of my favorite bands at the time was Switchfoot. I now no longer really listen to them quite often, but I did, and I was like a huge fan. So and they are kind of like, and it was also very typical that I was a huge fan of theirs, because they were kind of this Christian band, but they were not like overtly Christian in their lyrics, but you could tell that it was definitely like in all of their songs. You probably know them.
Oh, I've seen them in concert for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So that was always for me kind of like this way of just, listening to that kind of music every day, even if you don't go to church anymore. Like, it keeps that connection very much alive. Then I would say on the side, there was, I sometimes went to Taizé, which is this, you might have heard of it. It's this, what do you call it? How should I best describe it? It's kind of this town in France where people from all over the world, they gather there because it's basically a big sort of church kind of monastery kind of like community, and they welcome people throughout the year to participate and join them there. And you can come and leave whenever you want, but it's happening the entire year. And especially a lot of teenagers go there, and like, to be fair, like some teenagers also just go there for the fun. Like, they just like the campfires and also meeting new people and playing music together. But you can also tell that there's something like that. It sparks. It's a lot more spiritual than my experience was in the Protestant church. So it really, because you have a lot of like quiet there, and it's lots of it is very meditative, and you go to 3 services during the day, which sounds like a lot, but you get used to that like in no time. So going there like maybe once a year at some point, that really always kept my interest alive. That I was like, okay, I can tell that my belief in God is fading away, but whenever I'm there, it's sort of coming back again, and then I feel it again, and then it sort of fades away again. There was also this other organization that my parents took me to when I was 15, and that's kind of, it's a charismatic organization in the Netherlands, and they organize summer camps for younger kids and for teenagers, and they also have their own conferences twice a year. And they took me to the spring conference, so there's kids and teenagers and also older people, like they follow their own program where they go to lectures there, for instance, and there's also services there. And I was not looking forward to that at all. Like, it sounded very boring to me, but I knew that family members of mine were going, so they were like, hey, maybe if you like, no, not if you like, it was just expected that I would join them. Let me put it that way. So I did join, and that's where I met a bunch of really amazing people. And this is going to sound very strange, but for me, it was exactly what I needed. Is like, I was quite young, and at first I was kind of, okay, this is kind of boring here, but then we had the program that was kind of fun. And then in the evening, they started, going out, like having drinks together. They were like, hey, you want to join us for drinks? And I was like, for me, something very strange happened, because I think I already told you, like, the Protestant church had lost my interest because it was boring. And I was like, wait, so these Christian youths are drinking together? And for some reason, that's exactly what I needed when I was 16, like, by the way, the legal age to drink in the Netherlands at that time was 16. So it's not like it's crazy young for us. And therefore I met cool people who were into Christianity, and also they weren't like, I don't know, they weren't ignorant, and they were funny, and they were charismatic. Not to make a pun there, but they were genuinely charismatic. And that became a very important group of friends for me. So then that also was another pull, that I was going to go to once a year, and then join the summer camps from then onwards, and then later became a staff member to do the summer camps for younger children. And so that's also one thing, that even though I didn't go to church, I still felt connected there. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question.
No, it is. I mean, there's a lot of flavors of Protestantism. How would you describe the type of Protestantism that you were brought up with, that sort of bored you in so many words?
So I always have to admit that I'm definitely not an expert in all the denominations, so I find it very difficult to give a theoretical answer to it. I know it's very broadly, it's PKN, so that is Protestantse Kerk Nederland, Protestant Church of the Netherlands, which also means like it's a mixture of Reformed and And in that sense, it was how should I say it? Kind of, it has its progressive elements, but then again, it is also sort of quite conservative in form. But then you know that most of the sermons they do bring up societal issues, but not overtly that it's like that's the only thing that's on their mind. They also have this personal connection, and we would not be singing like worship songs. We'd be singing psalms and so the slower songs, which is probably part of something now I appreciate. Now if I go back to church, I'm like, I hear the church organ, I'm like, yes, I don't know, like something about it is wonderful. But at that time, like the organ was boring and the songs were slow, and but yeah, now I sort of see the benefit in that. But at the time, whenever I was listening to worship songs, even though I didn't think that was like the best kind of music out there, I could at least see like, yeah, this gets people a lot more hyped for Christianity. And again, now I think about that very differently. But when I was younger, I don't know, it didn't speak to me as well.
But there's something about that instinct when you were young. I definitely had more of that instinct, but I also grew up more in non-denominational Protestant evangelical churches. So you had the you had the rock bands. Like the church would go, and you would go to big Christian concerts where Switchfoot and all of these bands were playing, right? So it was more built into the tradition that I was given, and then somehow stumbled into very traditional very traditional participation, which is a curveball. My family still don't fully get it, but that's okay.
Right. No, it's a huge contrast.
Yeah, but how did your family react when you sort of got to this place where you kind of lost sight of religion, didn't really want to participate anymore? Was that sort of a big thing for your family, or was it more sort of laissez-faire?
Good question. I'm also curious how I want to ask you about that too.
Sure.
But I have one older sister, and she kind of went through something similar. And I would say that in some sense, I hope I'm not offending her by saying this, but that my parents were actually a bit more reassured by the way in which I handled my departure from faith, because for me, it was not just fading away. It was always this kind of like, yeah, but like I was struggling with it. I was kind of, wrestling with it still, which is also why when I later discovered philosophy, I became interested in another way. And then I came back to like, my father, he's a theologian. Forgot to add that for context. But then I would like, have these debates or conversations with him like, God cannot exist because X, and he would have, a response to that. And he would love it if I came home and just like challenge that. So because I think, he's fairly intellectual in his faith, he's also very much about personal connection. So it's not like he's just sort of this floating head. But at the same time, they appreciated that more than the alternative, which, so for instance, my older sister, who is also now interested in this space again. She doesn't go to church, but she became interested recently. But she just, like, her interest just kind of faded away, and at some point she just wasn't doing anything with it anymore. And they could tell that I was always wrestling. But I do remember my dad saying that he was kind of surprised when he overheard me say to a friend, like, I think I might be an atheist now, like kind of. But he also like appreciated that I was even thinking about those labels, like, okay, am I, maybe I'm no longer Christian, maybe I'm an atheist now. And I no longer carry the label atheist. And I was actually surprised to hear that I even did at some point, because I don't remember that being a strong phase. But they were okay with it. I would say my mom always found it a bit more sad, because like she's not a theologian, so for her it wasn't that interesting to talk about the intellectual aspect of it. She would sometimes hint like, oh, maybe you can find a nice church there, and but then again, she also loves me, so she knew that this was my own path and that it was genuine. So I never really felt harsh judgment, which is probably what made it easier for me to go back. To go back in some ways.
There wasn't like a feeling of harsh pressure either way, where it was like, if you leave, like, you're disowned, or if you go towards something, like,
I would almost say like that the hardest pressure came from the fact that my parents were so sure in their faith that that if you go back, you're kind of like, now I'm sort of signaling to them that they were right all along, and you don't want to give it to them. So that was like the pressure, but it's not because like you're angry with them or something like that.
Right. It's a different, there's a different level. There isn't an angst to it. It's more, yeah.
Correct.
I can see that.
To tell me a little bit about yourself, like there, I'm sure people from your channel might have heard this before, but like, how did your family respond, and if that was even?
Well, I went through different phases, right? So I think I always believed in God, and I always would have considered myself a Christian. There was never a space where I had the atheist phase, but there was, my younger years was sort of like I don't know if you can call it a naive commitment, but sort of that childlike commitment to the thing that's given to you, and the recognition that the path of faith is much more appealing than the other paths, because neither of my parents grew up in what I would say traditionally Christian religious families. My dad didn't really come to Christianity in college and was a bit antagonistic to it until that point. And my mom, they had faith in the house, but it's hard to say how stable and sort of typically religious that would have been. But they both sort of came to faith on their own college, young adult life. And so for me, I could see the different paths that some of, my other relatives took compared to them. And it's like, well, I do see this thing that gives them this life and this change and this generosity that was very appealing. And then, I had a little phase, sort of middle school, high school, where I didn't go away from church. I was still very involved, but I was very sort of apathetic and lukewarm to it, where it's like I would claim these things and I would say this, but I didn't quite live out Christianity. I wasn't doing anything crazy. I didn't party. I didn't do the typically bad things, but a lot of sort of like lying, deception, like, things to sort of like keep my life comfortable, and like half steps. And one thing led to another. Eventually in college, right before I started college, I had this experience that opened me up to that lukewarmness and how like apathetic and miserable it was making me. So I was like, okay, I've got to make a choice. I say I believe this thing. I have to like switch my intention and live it out like I actually believe it, or I can go this other way, but that doesn't look like it ends anywhere too well. Or you just keep doing the sort of half-hearted thing. And so this committed path was the only way I could go. So very much like switch my intention and trying to really understand, okay, what is this thing I believe, and how do I live it out best, and what is being asked of me in this path?
Also wrestling.
Yeah. And it totally changed me. Like I lost that sort of like depression and apathy, and I got a joy for learning and moving towards things. And so it was like, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going down this path until I can, be proved otherwise, right? Until I can find something that's more true. And, one thing led to another. You go to college, and I moved from Phoenix, Arizona, which is sort of a conservative Christian bubble, to San Francisco, going to San Francisco State University, living in Oakland, like being around all of this sort of very different ideas and perspectives on religion and faith. And I loved it. Like all of a sudden it was like, oh, wow, I can talk with these people who are very different and learn a lot. And so it kind of got me excited. And then, I moved to Australia, and eventually you get into sort of new atheism territory and like those questions, and you start wrestling with those. And then I kind of went through a deconstruction phase around 2016. The Trump election happened. And I think like with this sort of religious journey I had gone on, in the face with that, there were sort of all these questions about the narratives that I was given and what I was believing. And it just opened up all these questions of like, what story am I blindly accepting? And so you kind of like try to strip everything away and build up. And that's when I really got into sort of philosophy and apologetics on both ends, the theist and non-theistic sides of like, okay, well, what is it that we believe? Trying to get to that space of like, how can I hold to the thing that's true? And, long story shorter, it eventually led me back to Christianity. And I went back to sort of regular participation in the tradition that was somewhat of what I was given, maybe a bit more modern than what I had given, but still that sort of modern, non-denominational type of Christianity, with the idea that, or sort of the intuition that, well, there's probably one denomination that's likely more true than another, but I don't really know, and I haven't gotten to those questions. And so just plant somewhere and keep asking the questions and learn and take the time with it. And I did that for a couple of years. And I think after going through sort of deconstruction, seeing what people outside of the faith that I had grown up in this bubble thought about the thing that I did, all of a sudden it changed me and was like, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we do I don't think we fully understand, and we don't fully see how it looks from the outside in. And yeah, some criticisms that I think were quite right that came from non-religious people about church participation. And so there was always that wrestling with that. And one thing led to another. I came to the place where I realized this place that I was at was just not a healthy participation for me. I was too bothered by all of the things around me to like have a healthy participation. And if I can't participate healthily, that's just going to spread into like other places. So I won't run away from it, but I'll be open to something else. And that's when I started meeting all these Orthodox people and all of a sudden realizing, out of all of this like exploration and journey over the last 5-7 years of like deep exploration in philosophy and comparative religion, I never really encountered Orthodoxy much. I didn't know much about it. And I didn't think I would like it, but I eventually just went to a service, and that was sort of the end of it. I don't know why, but it was one of the... Yeah. Well, I was hooked. I don't know if souled's the right word, but it was like it drew me in a way that nothing else had, and there was this like sense of truth in it that I couldn't quite express. And so it was like, I don't know what this is, but I need to learn more about it. And like, I just don't feel comfortable calling myself Protestant anymore. And so then, 2 years later, I eventually became Orthodox. But it's funny, along that journey, I think some of the wrestling I kept sort of closer to my chest, and I never abandoned faith. So I think because my parents came to Christianity from an antagonistic position or a non-theistic position, it was sort of easier for them to see me wrestle through the questions. But I think if I came home and started saying I'm an atheist and all of the stuff, it probably would have worried them more. But I never would have been disowned, but it definitely would have been sort of like that pressure. But it was funny when I said, oh, I'm going to become Orthodox. My mom jokingly goes, sorry, what cult are you joining? And they grew up with sort of the like iconoclastic tradition where, the icons were, idols, and sort of the tradition was pointless.
That's also how I grew up, that I was like, okay, but at least like how, let me put it this way, like obviously my parents, they're sophisticated and stuff, so I don't like, they didn't give me a simplistic narrative. But just when I asked like, hey, what's the difference between this and the Catholic Church? And then you're like, oh, the Catholic Church, they have all these images. Like the Orthodox Church is basically non-existent for me. Like, it's like the Protestant Church or the Catholic Church. And then it's like, but we think that God doesn't want us to make images of him, so therefore we're non-imagistic. It's kind of similar in that sense.
There was sort of that fight against Catholicism, where it's like, oh, Catholics do this and whatever, and it's sort of softened as we've grown up. But you kind of got that idea of like, oh no, that the icons and stuff, not good, we don't do that. And so at first it was sort of like, okay, what is this thing? All right, they thought it was a phase. And then so they would push on some things, but it was sort of like that thing in the background. It's like, I know they think this is weird, but whatever, I just have to keep doing it. And then when I officially became or said I was going to become Orthodox, I invited them to my chrismation. And that's when all the questions just started coming. What about child baptism? What about, icons? What about these things? And I was at the position, I got some advice from a friend well, actually, a friend got advice from her priest and she gave it to me because she was in a similar position as I. And she was sort of like, well, your job is not to defend orthodoxy. Your job is to become Orthodox.
Yeah.
So, you know, when your family asks these questions, don't feel like you have to have the perfect answer. Just like do your best. So that's sort of how I was like, well, this is how I understand it, but I'm happy to like refer you to something that might be able to give you a better answer because you know, I just don't have that. And so I think that lightened the tension because I didn't fight back and wasn't like angsty about it, which I could have been. But I don't know, for some reason, when it came to orthodoxy, that angst that I had about fighting about these questions and like wrestling with these softened. Like before, it was sort of like I had to be a bulldog in trying to like fight through these things and like put up the strongest argument that I could to see where it was weak. And then when someone would challenge it, I'd go home and I'd fact check myself and others and try to like really get to the bottom of these questions. And then when I came to orthodoxy, it was sort of like that like fierceness went away. It was just, I was just so intrigued by it that curiosity I think drew me more than
I see.
that like that defensiveness of like I have to find the answers. And some of that too I think was just the way that the priest I was working with kind of talked about orthodoxy and brought me in. They were sort of like, hey, we're here to answer any of your questions, but like the church is always here. So if you need to look at Catholicism or other things, like that's totally fine. And so it took that pressure off of like, we're trying to get you in and sign you up as fast as you can. There was sort of that place of like, okay, I can ask questions, I can look and think about these things. But it was funny every time I was given an answer, even from the beginning, it just sat with me in a way that nothing else had, where it was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And that makes a lot more sense than the thing I was given before, which made a lot of sense to me. And so it sort of like took this thing that, you know, was good and very deep and just like deepened it even more and cemented it to a place where it was like, oh, okay. Just like switched some things around and like made it a lot deeper. So yeah, there was a little bit of that antagonism at first. So there was like a couple of those like tensions, but I tried my best to like not make it a fight. And yeah, now it's a lot better. I think they still have uncertainty. Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting as I grow. And I mean, I live in the Netherlands now, so it's a little more removed. They don't have to see me going to church or to the liturgy every day. And like, they've actually come to me a couple of times with liturgy. And my mom said something one time where she, you know, she was like, I get why you like it. It's very beautiful. And that was like, to me, it was like, okay, like that was just not something I'd ever thought I'd hear my mom say. So yeah, I think there's places where they're kind of open to it. You know, I wouldn't say they're like, you know, open to converting, which I'm like, that's not really my like goal or desire, right? It's not like, oh, I want to see my whole family converted. I think it's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, there's that sort of like softening where it doesn't feel as dire. Because I think at first there was that fear of like, oh, well, is she believing something that's a lie? Is she participating in something that's going to be how would you say it, destructive to a spiritual practice? I think they feel less of that now. It's probably helpful that it's still Christianity. If I had become like a Buddhist or, you know, a Hindu, you might be like, but you know, it's still sort of Christianity. And
no, that's really fair. And I also think, I don't know what's so nice about that moment of your mother sort of saying that, like, you know, she appreciated something about it, is that you feel seen in that moment, you know. So that's like, oh, okay, so at least like I always find it very difficult. Also now growing back into sort of an interest in spirituality after I've been in this kind of, you know, progressive atheist environment for a while, I can tell that, like, but this is also something that I need to deal with myself, but that I find it very difficult if I just sort of explain it to people, and that I could just tell that people are like, okay, well, you know, you do you, sure, and I get that a lot. Like you get that a lot because people are obviously like they've never heard of it, and they're not super interested. But then I love it if someone actually is interested and they keep asking questions, and then at some point, like I don't want them to like to convert them or something like that, but at least they're like, ah, okay, now I see, I respect that. Like I see why that interests you. Like then I feel seen, and I don't know, like that's what it reminded me of when you just related that story of your mom saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the difficult part for me, it was funny, they'd get really concerned about a question. And this response would be like, I don't know much about Orthodoxy, but here's what I don't like about it. And it was like sort of funny. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, there was like that admittance of like, okay, I don't really understand it. Cause that's how I felt too. It's like, I don't know this thing. Like you
Yeah.
hear a lot about Catholicism, but I do think that Protestantism and Orthodoxy in some ways have more similarities than Catholicism and Orthodoxy. But vice versa too. Like there's things about Catholicism and Orthodoxy that are much more similar than Protestantism. And so it's this weird,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I don't want to say middle ground, but like this weird relationship with both of these traditions that all of a sudden for me made more sense out of all of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was sort of that yeah, I think that was hard where it was like you have this idea of what this thing is, but it's not exactly what it is in practice, and this like the fullness, and it's hard to fully describe orthodoxy, particularly because it's very participatory. Like
Yeah.
when I was going into orthodoxy, a lot of people were like, or I was asking, oh, okay, what book should I read, how do I learn more about this? And the answers I would get were like, well, you can read the saints, I guess.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like read about the lives of the saints. And I had a couple modern suggestions, but they're like, honestly, I would just go to church and talk to a priest. And so that's what I did. And there was something about that I think integrated all of the questions and the intellectual part with the spiritual practice a lot more, where I could understand it. I don't know if I could understand it better, but like there was more of a trust in taking those steps to understand it.
Yeah, I get that.
So, um,
Which is also what makes it so difficult to communicate it to outsiders because
yeah.
like I don't know, it's like sort of an understanding by doing and not an understanding by knowing, it's like yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I get really cautious about like, this is the Orthodox way. Because it's like, I have been the most generous estimates around Orthodoxy for 4 or 5 years. That is so limited in the scope of what Orthodoxy is, the history, and all of these things. And for me, I have tried to lean away from that sort of intellectual over consumption pattern with Orthodoxy and just be like, okay, I need to participate and sort of just let this sink in, and the questions are there, and when they're ready for answers, the things will come. But yeah, I think that advice of not being a defender of orthodoxy has been really helpful for me, because it's like those are two different things, of defending orthodoxy and being an advocate for it. Because for me, it's like I recognize there's all of these things about orthodoxy and Christianity that I don't know. And being Orthodox, there's that trust in the mystery. So there's going to be all of these things that I can't know. But that is different than taking what you can see and what you can apprehend, putting your trust in that and seeing the way that it changes you. And so that's been that's been easier for me, because I don't know, I haven't asked them directly, but I can see the difference of my person from when I was not Orthodox to now. And I'm by no means at all perfect, but there's this like calmness and peace and trust in it that I didn't have in anything else, even in the moments I felt like I trusted something really deeply. And so that's been sort of the thing that holds it to me. And I think my family sees that as well. And so there's that sort of I think that softening in them to not bring so much challenge to it, but to just let it play out, voice the concerns when they need to, which I'm actually very happy about. I'm sort of I can be sort of like that challenging personality. I like to be challenged, and I like to think through things, and put myself in situations where I am not the norm because I just learned so much from it. And so seeing my family make those challenges and like bring these things up, yeah, it's like, well, first of all, it shows that you care about me, because if you didn't, you wouldn't talk about this at all. But two, it makes me think through these things and makes me look more deeply as I take the steps. And, it gives me some confidence to move forward with that challenge.
Yeah, that's good. It's good. It's actually like you're sort of describing the state that I want to arrive at, like hopefully in the not too distant future. Because I can tell, like, at least from my perspective, that is also related to my interest in philosophy, is that especially this last few years, I was very happy to go on this intellectual journey into mysticism, esoteric religions, but then also more mainstream religions and philosophical traditions, because in some ways I could always, I should say it, I was always responsible to questions responsive to questions about my motivations, because I could always like sort of lay out arguments, might be the wrong word, but at least I could just lay out sort of the propositions that would help a person make sense of my stance.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to get good at communicating myself. And
Right.
I think it came to the point where I got interested in certain things that were then like a little bit less mainstream. Let's say at least like the first time, if you're in a progressive non-theist environment, then it's already quite tricky to communicate to someone else that you are not a materialist, to just kind of say like, okay, actually, I think there might be more to this life than just matter. And that's why I came to that like sort of through means of argument. And that was kind of interesting, because like then I can have sort of discussion with people. But I can tell that I'm at this breaking point now. It's not a breaking point, but at least transition point, I should say, where now I can feel that there's this new phase in front of me where I will sadly no longer be able to really explain through my words what I'm going through, what I'm experiencing, and what my life is going to be like. And people will just have to see it by how I'm changed or by them participating themselves. And I find that, to be fair, I also like, that's why I'm be curious to hear your thoughts about this. But part of it is that's a bit terrifying for me, because I currently, so my girlfriend, for instance, she is a non-believer, though fortunately I obviously talk to her every day, so I don't feel an alienation there. But with friends, I speak to them less often, and as I said, like I was able to talk to them and sort of lay out the propositions, and they could sort of get it, even if they didn't always completely get it, but they could sort of get it. And I can tell that this is like feeling this phase where I no longer need to explain everything, but just do. And I know they would be okay with it, but from my perspective, I'd be like, oh, but I'd be losing them, because like now I can at least give them a sense of why I, think about the world in this way. And that will no longer be the case in this next phase. But at the same time, I can feel it calling me. So I'm curious if you ever had that moment.
Yeah. Oh, totally. But I think you would be surprised about what actually happens.
Tell me, please.
Well, because I think when I was younger, and then up into sort of before I went through the deconstruction phase of like taking apart what I was given and asking those questions, it was much more of like a do, and let the doing lead to the explanation, right?
Yeah.
And I had so much more joy, and like life was a much easier, like things flowed a lot better. But then you came to that place where you lost so much of the confidence on the thing that you were doing, that like I had to go through this phase where I needed to get it in my head and tried to get to the place where I could explain it all, or explain it enough to like make sense of it to myself to keep doing. And I don't think I could have avoided that. But, finding orthodoxy, all of a sudden it was a switch where, I'd done all of this sort of like stone turning and got to the place where I could at least feel that confidence. And then when this piece fell in, all of a sudden, it made sense of the whole picture of everything that I had done there. So all of a sudden I could throw myself into orthodoxy in a healthy way, because there's certainly times you can throw yourself into religion and go to an extreme, and I think it can be unhealthy. But taking that place where I could take that trust and do this in a healthy, measured way.
Right. Yeah.
And it switched me from figuring out, like, trying to be able to explain it, everything, and, you know, have that logical consistency. You're just living it and letting it change me. And then all of a sudden, you know, I would still want to talk about these things because I have just such an interest in the big questions and hearing how other people think about things. And I started, so when I would start talking about orthodoxy, it felt like people were more genuinely interested and intrigued by those conversations and sort of open to it than when I was like in that head wrestling with myself, trying to get the right words out. They were all of a sudden like, oh, I've never thought about it before. Oh, that's really interesting. Like, and like, it was sort of that genuine interest. And I always had that places where I never went out of my way. Well, there were times I would go with certain people out of my way to test and like stoke those conversations because, you know, that was sort of the mode that those relationships opened up, and there was healthiness and at least helpfulness on my end in developing those questions. But you know, after a while with new people, I didn't jump in and try to like steer the conversation in that way. It just was natural to me and it would come that way. So you would get those people who were interested, but it was much more sort of that like push and pull back and forth, sort of like wrestling. Where now it feels like, no, I just like, there's an excitement and a beauty that I'm seeing that when I share it, even if I don't have all the right words or the full understanding, there's like little pieces of intrigue that people don't need the list of things in you in perfect words, because to be honest, the words that make sense to you are not going to make sense to your neighbor and, you know, the person across the world. Like, language is a little tricky in that way, but there is something about action and that transformative power of looking at people's lives that speak in a way that words can't quite like find tangible.
Which is also the best, I should say, like, it's just most convincing if you see someone transformed as opposed to them laying out a consistent argument, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I look back now and I think, you know, there was this time period of my life where it's like I really needed to get the arguments in my head and I needed the debate so that, you know, if I was wrong, I could be proved wrong. And like through that, you know, I came to the same place as you through this like intellectual wrestling with the antithesis of what I believed. It led me with more of a confidence to what I believe now. There was certainly a space for that, but that place where you have that integration and you follow the thing that's beautiful and good and true and participate in that the best way you can in the way you understand it, just leads to more of that, more clarifying of that. And I just think even in the times where it's hard or difficult or has suffering, if you take it with this place of humility and try to show the beauty of it instead of where everybody else is wrong.
It's good.
People, like, there's a natural intrigue because people are curious. People are curious about other people. It doesn't matter who you are. But
no, that's totally correct. And I also think, like, for me, I think the false impression that I'd gotten was partly related to the fact that I became interested again in these ideas when I was doing my bachelor's, and therefore, you know, I lived in a house with like 9 other people, and you know, every time, like every day during dinner, like you'd have to have conversations, or in the evening you'd have conversations, and obviously in class you have all these conversations, and then even at parties you'd have conversations. So it's like so constant that you think that the way in which you and your environment makes sense of things is just to sort of, you know, kind of in a friendly manner, but sort of argue back and forth and have discussions and see, you know, like what makes most sense, to then, you know, actually after that moment when I sort of, you know, I was done studying and, you know, I still visit my friends every now and then, but now that we don't have that sort of everyday basis of just like, discussing intellectual stuff. And also now that, most of them have just started, if I dare to say, like somewhat more regular jobs, which are not about, like, let's say just jobs outside of academia. Let me just put it that way.
There's a
Which are not
difference.
exactly, which is not about always gathering new intellectual insights and stuff, which is obviously very much related to the discipline that I'm working in right now. And you can kind of tell, like, oh, I thought, or I made myself think that the way in which I should deal with this sort of renewed interest in religion and philosophy is through lots and lots and lots of discussion and arguments. And now I kind of see in these last few years, well, first of all, that simply I cannot demand that of people, because that's not the kind of environment that we live in anymore, and people don't have that kind of time anymore. But also that it's like, well, even if they would have, at some point you need to start living it, as opposed to indeed only discuss it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, there's all these like different phases that I went as I'm going through this journey. And so, there was the phase of the apologetics, of like trying to understand like the defenses and the arguments and all of those things. And it would sometimes, as I was going up towards the end of that participation, probably sort of on the cusp of finding Estuary, and sort of leaving this sort of idea space of the online world, there was these conversations of like, more people just need to know apologetics. And I think, well, like for in some places I found it helpful, and there's a place for it. I don't think it should stop. But there's this other part of like the recognition that sometimes that is the worst thing that you can do for someone in a participation and creating a healthy spiritual balance. And I would recognize like, well, I needed this intellectual bout to make sense of life and move forward. But I get sometimes jealous of the people who never did, who just had that like undying faith, like that simple faith. And it's like, I can't wish that I didn't go through it, because I think for me, it helps create a space where I can try to attain for that more, where I feel safer in the home that I find myself in, or the garden that I find myself in. But there's that there's that I don't know, if you've wrestled enough with the spiritual questions and you want that like sincere spiritual participation, like you can't help but feel jealous of some of those people who just don't need that at all.
Oh yeah. Agreed. That's obviously the case.
Yeah.
But I also no, I totally agree. But I also, in getting to know myself, I've just accepted like, okay, this is just sort of the way that I'm supposed to deal with it. And I could tell
100%.
that it was difficult to find another way for me. And also I think that in doing so, I've been able to have conversations with other people, and through those conversations I've allowed myself to be inspired, and I've inspired them, which otherwise simply wouldn't have happened. So people would have just been like, okay, so, and then I would have opened up different space had I've gone that route, but I haven't. So
and I find myself in a similar place too, where if I tried to do the simplistic, just have faith, I would have lost it. Like I had like, for whatever reason, we have different paths on how we go about these things. And I just had to do this, this very difficult wrestling path. But, I mean, I look at someone like Ferdi. We had very different participations in how we came to religion and faith, and we ended up in the same spot. But, for him, he had much more of that sort of easygoing space, where like, I always say for me, it was like, I was in a river and I was swimming against the current, trying to like gain some solid ground, and he's just like hanging out, floating in the stream, let it take him where it's gonna go. And there's that envy's the wrong word, but there's like appreciation for his path and what he did. Yet the recognition that, well, my path was something I need to, and now that we're married and we come together, we balance each other out, and we learn from each other and how to participate things. And so that's really beautiful too.
Yeah, exactly. And Indeed, it's not, you can sometimes be like, I think you mentioned the word jealous. You can be that, but you also know that there's aspects of your journey that would then make other people jealous, which then in turn allows you to realize, oh, so I shouldn't be jealous in the first place. I should just kind of be like accepting, and then also be appreciative, and then be, wondering and curious about sort of this other way of orientation. Yeah. So that's what.
Totally. It's like if we all had the same strengths and journeys, we wouldn't be able to see the beauty of like the diversity of what it is to actually be human and to participate in the spiritual path in so many ways that we're we're all experiencing it. So
Yeah, and I would also just add to that, like just to give a very concrete example. So now I'm teaching philosophy, and obviously, like I couldn't have. And in my teaching, obviously, I teach the text that I'm supposed to teach. I'm not gonna sort of
you go
preach to
rogue.
them, something like that. But I can sometimes tell that there's something about the way in which I explain a text that sparks interest from, a bunch of philosophy students. And I'm currently in the situation that, I teach. Well, I've taught hundreds of people, because at some point you've just, so many classes have passed by. And so if with it, like in that group of 100 or more, or like a couple hundred philosophy students, you've even managed to sort of spark the interest of one, and maybe like, oh, maybe there's something else going on here. Then maybe that was my journey, and that was my way of communicating it to people, and other people have their ways, but I can be sort of thankful for, okay, this is how it works for me, and maybe I can inspire other people in that same way.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good place to kind of pivot it to Estuary. So
Yeah,
we've obviously been both involved in Estuary in different ways and different capacities, but you're coming to speak at our conference in Germany, or festival, whatever you want to call it. I guess to start, sort of what brought you to Estuary, and kind of explain that path and where you hope to see yourself in the participation in that.
Yeah.
Big question, but
yeah, it's exactly like I would say that what I mentioned, like that during my bachelor's, I sort of became interested again in these questions, and that is twofold, and it's also going to be related, I guess, to what I'm going to be talking about during the festival, to give a small teaser. But I started taking philosophy classes during my bachelor's, and that was kind of interesting because my professor clearly was someone who was raised in a Christian, maybe even a fundamentalist family. He was also from the States, and he was clearly damaged by that, and he has made his life's work to argue against central tenets of Christianity. So therefore, it's kind of strange because, like as I mentioned, I was kind of, I had wandered off the Christian path at that point in my life, but to find someone so passionately going against it, I was like, well, wait a minute, like I need to like I just felt like some of his criticism was unfair because it was like my background. So even though I was like, okay, I also don't really sort of believe in it anymore, I could say at that time.
Yeah.
I still think like I was still engaging with his criticism because like I just think it's simplistic. I think it's far-fetched. I don't think this is helpful. I think it would be much more interesting to, if you're gonna criticize it, to do it this way. And he also, so one of the ways in which he challenged us, which is, by the way, so funny because barely anyone was from a Christian background there, because again, it was this sort of progressive environment, but is have us read Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, sort of reading Nietzsche was like a shock to me, because Nietzsche is not just, he doesn't give like, how should I say it, arguments against the existence of God or something like that. So it's not about the intellectual stuff. It's actually like he gives psychological arguments about, oh, you think, you're loving your neighbor, you think that's a good thing. Well, what if it's actually based in weakness? And what if it's actually based in sort of a deep feeling of vengeance towards those who are more powerful than you are? And the thing is, like, this sounds very cynical, but he actually makes persuasive arguments to then make people doubt their own. So indeed, not just their logical argumentation about what is truthful, but also just their orientation and what values they think are important to have, like the value of truth, the value of morality. And he makes you wonder about those things. But at the same time, like by doing that, I was really like, I thought I was just sort of like kind of wandering off the Christian path, but I was like back into it again because it's like, whoa, I need to deal with this. And then I started reading all of Nietzsche's works, became sort of very interested in it. And then he kind of became my main interest because like the more you read of Nietzsche, the more you find out that he is this individual who has been struggling with a Christian background himself. So he has a Lutheran father who passed away at a very young age, and he was very Christian when he was much younger. And there's elements of him appreciating the figure of Jesus in his work. So he's also having this sort of back and forth with Christianity, even though he can be so destructive against it. And while doing that, I was looking up sort of kind of like content on YouTube, maybe some lectures on Nietzsche, because I was getting into Nietzsche. So I was reading it myself, but also interested to see what other people had to say about it. And I actually think that's the first time that I discovered someone like Jordan Peterson, who was also lecturing on Nietzsche. And that was kind of interesting because his reading of Nietzsche was, even though I'm now fairly critical of it because I don't think he's clearly not an expert in Nietzsche, let me just put it that way. But it was still interesting because he, for instance, him reading the Death of God passage by Nietzsche really emphasized how Nietzsche was like panicking about, you know, the falling away of the Christian morality and what that would mean. And that sort of made me realize, like, okay, wait a minute, if that's true, and it seems to be true, like, so I can, at least from my own experience, confirm that is likely to have been the case for Nietzsche, then I really need to deal with this a question surrounding the importance of Christianity in a whole new way, not just in sort of the is it true or not manner, but also in the like, what is its purpose and what it fades away kind of manner. And which is why I became much more interested in then arguing against my philosophy professor. So my point is, that's kind of when I discovered Jordan Peterson, and he was kind of this interesting figure. And especially, I think if I would discover him now, I'd be much more critical, because as we all know, Peterson is a great psychologist, and he tends to also talk a lot about stuff that he knows a little bit less about, but they can still have useful insights, but they can also be wrong in a useful way, and sometimes they can be right in a useful way. But by then I was just an ignorant bachelor student, so for me it was very interesting to discover his works and listen to his talks, and especially the psychology talks were super fascinating. And then I got into the people that, you know, that were commenting on him, and then I could see that many people were going against him, and we all sort of know it, that criticism quite often was fairly simplistic, so it was frustrating to listen to that. And then it was also interesting to see someone like, you know, a pastor, I think the YouTube title was "A Pastor Responds to Jordan Peterson's Biblical Series" or something like that. So you click on that and you're kind of like, okay, this is interesting, because now there's finally some, like, this individual, Jordan Peterson, has renewed my interest in religion, sort of from this Jungian way. But I hear the church being awfully silent on it, like, and I can tell that whenever I discuss it with church folks, that they're not sort of interested in it. But I could also tell that when I was discussing it with some of my atheist friends, they were interested in it. They were like, okay, that's interesting, let's talk about this. Like all these, you know, very sciencey arguments about faith. And, sure. And that's why discovering Paul at that time, Paul van der Klei, like his channel was very interesting. But I also wasn't hooked right away because I was very intellectual about it. And as we discussed, like, Paul is all about people and really trying to understand people and discussing and talking to randos, which is, I think, a word that you coined at some point.
Yes. in my first randos conversation, I was struck by, said something to the effect of like, I can't believe you just sit and talk to randos on the internet.
Yeah.
And Jeff thought that was hilarious. And so he brought it up when he talked to Paul the next time, and it stuck. So
yeah.
But
that's the internet. And
yeah. Well, now I do it.
Yeah, but nice. Yeah, exactly. So it's great that you took over this format. But that kind of sent me on a journey of really, because I was more intellectually interested, I became interested in the rebel wisdom kind of space. I became interested in his discussions with Sam Harris first, but then I felt that wasn't very satisfying, because I didn't feel like Sam Harris was a good faith debater fundamentally. In superficially he was, but fundamentally I felt he wasn't.
Well, those were really hard to listen to. I'll let you keep going, but that's like the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates were like, especially the first podcast they did. it was actually really frustrating to listen to. And at that point, I was probably more in that intellectual, logical space. So when I was hearing Sam Harris talking, I tended more towards like the understanding of what he was saying. It was like, yeah, it was like sort of like Peterson rails against postmodernism, but as he's talking about it, he's kind of talking like a postmodernist to Sam Harris, who was definitely not. And so it was like, but then as time went on, I realized it's like, okay, there was two people playing two different games with two different like ideas of how the structure of the conversation should go. And neither of them were like, gonna accommodate and change that. So it was like just at the standstill. So it was much more a communication issue than I think probably like a meaningful bad faith participation. But like,
no, of course.
that was just so hard to listen to.
I will say, like, if you've planned like 4 lectures, like, and if you're like purposefully, like consciously bad faith about it, then something is going wrong, because like then you will feel after the first lecture. But it was clear that they were, again, superficially good faith enough that they could balance each other out over the lectures. And it was still interesting to me. And then I listened to like Paul's commentary on those as well. I found those very interesting. So that's sort of how I sort of stayed interested in Paul. But then I like found, for instance, John Vervaeke, a much more interesting non-theist to discuss stuff with Jordan Peterson. So I remember also like looking at like finding their old sort of discussion, which was uploaded to YouTube in like 2012 or something like that, like way before. And that like the top comment was also like, this is what I wanted from the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversation. I was like, yes, I could tell that I'm looking for these types of conversations.
Right.
So it was still quite intellectual. And then I became interested in Pajot, but I didn't understand him. Like, so it's like, just kind of, I was intrigued. And I guess that I like that he talked about pop culture, like movies and stuff, because that made it a little bit more accessible, but that I was still kind of like, what is he on about? I can tell there's something there, but I find it very difficult to wrap my head around. Just sort of the way in which he discussed it, which I also think, like, to be a little bit fair to ourselves, like I think he also developed a more clear explanation of his ideas throughout the years that he's been in this space. But having said that, so like this sort of it was kind of all developing. And then I saw that, like that Paul was talking to John and John was talking to Jonathan. And then, like the 3 of them discuss things together. But then there's all these other voices, like yourself. And then we had like obviously Mary Cohen, and you have Sevilla King, and you have all these people that are talking to each other. And you can tell like something is emerging here, but it wasn't clear what until like that term, this little quarter of the internet, was coined.
Well, it's still not clear, but
yeah, exactly. It's still not entirely clear what it is. And that's kind of funny about each of these conferences, that they still discuss like, what are we actually doing here? And I think that's, it's still fascinating. But that allowed me to get interested in this idea of like, oh, okay, this is good, because now I can tell that sort of Vervaeke is pushing towards like, okay, now we need to motivate people to start doing practices and collectively to get together. And Paul was kind of like, okay, me and Jonathan have been saying for people to go to church, but I know that for many people that's just too radical a step. So maybe we can find this sort of intermediate space. And at that point, I had been like, the way in which I was introduced to Paul more personally was through Job, who I think many of us know here in this space, because I think my dad thought it would be an interesting idea, because he was just fascinated by my intellectual journey. So he was like, who are all these people? So he started listening to some of them as well. And he started contacting Paul, like, oh, maybe it would be fun to have a conversation. And then Paul contacted us, or brought us into contact with Job, who we then met up in person with. And I could tell that Job found it very useful and pleasant to meet up with us. And we found it very useful and pleasant to meet up with him. And then he was like, well, maybe we should have a conversation with the 4 of us, with Paul there. And that was our first sort of time that we were... that we appeared on Paul's channel and had a really good discussion. And then it became a little bit more, skin in the game kind of stuff, that you could tell like, okay, now I'm here a little bit, I'm in this corner. Which is also why then when, the first Estuary Festival event happened last year, when Paul came over to Europe, that Job reached out to me and my dad was like, hey, would you guys first like to meet up, and then maybe also, would you guys like to help out organizing the Dutch sort of Bridges of Meaning estuary kind of event, where we have the goals of starting these estuaries? And well, I think like the rest is more or less history, but like that's how we started getting interested in welcoming Paul, but then also not having that just be sort of a celebrity Paul van der Klei is here event, but also starting connections. And I'm happy to say that indeed we started, like there is something of an estuary going right now, maybe even two, I think, right now in the Netherlands, but they're not on a consistent basis yet, which is why I'm still interested to continue organizing the estuary and actually to maybe give it an extra boost by doing that this year in October. So that's a long answer, but it was a tough question. So
No, great. It was a question that needed a long answer. If you were done in 2 minutes, I'd be like, all right, we got to unpack this. Yeah, well, no, that's really interesting. I mean, and something you had told me previously is that what originally drew you to this place was the intellectual side, yet what kept you here was the human side. Do you want to kind of flesh that out a little bit more?
I think that's really good, because I was I can sometimes like surprise myself a little bit about that. I know that I have a human side, but that I can be open and vulnerable to other people about that. And that's what was so nice about the event last year, because we also, besides the festival in Germany, we had a 1-day sort of Dutch event where Paul came over and lots of people from all over the country visited. And we had a sort of a chat with Paul there, and we recorded that, and that's on his channel now as well, with Job and my dad again, and with Sarah Fulmer as well. Which was quite wonderful. And after that, we had them explain the Estuary Protocol, because John van Donk was there as well, obviously famous for the Estuary Protocol, and he suggested, hey, maybe some of you should try out the Estuary Protocol here right now. So we split up into groups, and then just quick recap for those of you who don't know the protocol. It's like you're asked to in a little group just share something that was maybe on your mind or happening in your life, like between now and the last moment you met up, or obviously if it's the first time, just what's been going on recently. And you could do that on 4 fronts. So I think it's intellectually, which is obviously something that I was interested in, but then also personally, what's been going on in your own life, or contextually, what's been happening in your environment, or fourthly, estuarily, which is like, do you have thoughts about the format of the estuary, and would you maybe like to change it in some ways? And that was interesting, because I think I was going in there to further the intellectual discussions, but then we had very, very personal discussions about people struggling with family relationships. I mean, obviously won't go into detail, because you sort of you obviously trust each other. You don't bring them out for privacy reasons. But you could kind of tell that, wow, this is very strange, because I thought that if people wanted to talk about this kind of stuff, so let's say this very personal, difficult, I don't know, like, just personal stuff, that they should probably see a therapist or something like that, or they should talk to their friends. But it's clear that people want to do that in a context where they actually find deep meaning. And that's when I found out that sort of the intellectual and the personal, that it touched, and which also made me appreciate sort of my background in church much more than I did before, because I could tell, like, it's not just about the fact that I want to tell someone about what's going on in my life. I also want to do it in this context of relating it to what is actually most meaningful in life. So I think that that's just a sort of, well, kind of a lengthy, but also a short answer to, I could then see that people need this. There's many people that actually don't just want the personal side of it. They want it really combined with sort of this bigger, almost like, I guess, metaphysical side of it, and this spiritual layer, and this philosophical layer, and the scientific layer, and sort of combine that all into be able to embed these personal conversations in a context which will allow them to meaningfully transform themselves. Yeah.
Right. Well, because I think the way that it often plays out now, you have the hyper personal side,
Agreed. Yeah.
that's about feelings, and we create safe spaces and nothing gets
Yeah.
challenged. And then you've got the hyper intellectual sides where it's debate, facts, logic. We don't
Right.
care about feelings, but there's not a lot of space in this middle ground where it's
Yeah.
like you can bring the personal and interweave that with the intellectual and all of these other things and try to create a fuller picture of what's going on in both
Right.
sides. And I
Yeah.
think for me, and it's sort of coming together as you're talking about it,
Yeah.
a lot of us are looking at the intellectual side probably because of some personal thing that's happening in your
Yeah.
life that's like looking for you to ground. So we move towards this intellectual side, or vice versa, right? Like if you're, I think for some people who get very deeply emotional and are more in tune with the emotional side of themselves, you can swing to the other side where you get really involved in sort of the self-care, or maybe a very charismatic type of religion, and throw yourself into that with the instinct and the feeling versus the facts, logic, argumentation, debate sort of side. But they're
Yeah.
two extremes of a similar path where it's like, okay, you've got this thing in your life that's very personal and vulnerable that is leading you towards a space that needs something deeper to ground it.
Yeah.
So Estuary, by being people first, while also opening up the door to ideas and the challenging and wrestling with those, creates a space where you can do it. I mean, better maybe isn't the
Yeah.
right word, but there's probably a space and a market for each of those things. But
I,
there's
I,
a
I
place.
would say it's more radical in a way, but
Yeah.
in both sense of radical, that radical also relates to roots, like etymologically, that you're interested in, like, how am I fairly deeply grounded?
Right.
Like honestly, like how am I deeply grounded and embedded in a context? But then also, radical in the sense like, wow, it's actually you don't easily have these conversations elsewhere. So
Right. Yeah, it's I would say it's sort of the unorthodox way of like getting to like the thoughts of these questions, because
yeah,
typically it's like one way, oh, you go to the apologetics route where it's
yeah,
whatever side you're on, trying to create arguments to justify whatever your belief is, or it's the faith route of like throw yourself in to that side and just
yeah,
do whatever you can, hold on to it. And it becomes sort of in this middle ground where it's more integrated, but it's not traditional in the
yeah.
sense of like, at least what I was given and what I think a lot of people were given, of like how you come to good answers to true questions.
Yeah, and I also think that at least like that's kind of been my interest in the last few years, that obviously it's become a cliche to say that individualism has become very rampant in our society and in our generation. And I think that the context of the context of sharing our feelings and our emotions has also been happening in a mostly individualistic space, so that people are kind of like, well, I just want to say how I feel. And there's something very important about that, because people should feel open and vulnerable to share their feelings. But at the same time, to just do it because, this is how I feel and I don't want to be questioned about that.
Mm,
Like that can actually, if you're not careful about that, that can actually make the problem somewhat worse. Whereas if
right.
you're then relating that to like, so what is this bigger thing outside of me, this bigger context, these other people that I should be relating myself to
Right.
while dealing with my personal issues. That
Mm,
can actually be transformative, but it can be, but it's less likely to be transformative if you're just like, well, I'm not happy right now, so I'm going to share my feelings and I hope that I'll be happy, because then it's still kind of all about you. It's about your personal happiness as opposed to feeling part of something that allows you to indeed meaningfully transform yourself. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think that's a lot of that comes to the big question of like, well, what is this story we find ourselves in, right? Like as humans,
That's
like we,
correct. Yeah.
I've got an idea of what the story is. You've got an idea of the story is. I promise they're not the same. Yeah, we're living in the same story, and so there's that recognition of like, well, is sharing our feelings and wrestling with these questions and going through suffering is that end goal to bring happiness. Well, that's certainly what a lot of people give lip service to, but I think when you really start to pull that apart and get deeper, it's like, well, maybe there's something bigger to this question. And I think that's where you have a lot of these differences in finding those places where it's like, oh, well, maybe instead of happiness there's something deeper, more meaningful that we're moving towards.
Yeah, and what you said, like that, indeed, like we have our own idea, sort of our own conscious idea of what our own stories are, maybe, and that if you are really able to go in depth in these kinds of discussions or conversations, I should say, then you might realize that actually, indeed, what you said, like you're part of a similar story. So you're remembering something in the deep sense. And you can also play with the word remembering, like, becoming a member of something again. Of like, okay, yeah, actually we are part of a shared story, but that, and then when you are remembering that, you're kind of like, okay, I see that this is something that I've known all my life, but I've only just made it sort of, come to my awareness. So it's kind of strange because we think of remembering as something that happens like, okay, I was aware of this before and now I'm aware of this again. But sometimes we have this feeling of really deep, profound memory where we're kind of like, yeah, I've kind of known this all my life, but I never knew that I was looking for this. And that's precisely the type of realization that can happen in such a context.
Right.
Then you realize your common story.
Well, I think there's something interesting about Estuary where it really is about creating a neutral space where all of these different perspectives come together. Whereas a church has very different sort of intent, right? And it depends on what kind of church and how much emphasis they put on a certain thing. But there's certainly a path of like, this is the grand narrative that we see, and we're holding to it, and we're if you're a member of this thing, like you see it too, and we're all moving towards it together. Whereas here, you kind of get to take this place where you can compare those stories and look at it and see, okay, how do I make sense in this ultimate narrative? Because we have this instinct that there is something more ultimate besides our story. Otherwise, we wouldn't change our minds, or we wouldn't have this sense of somebody's story being different than ours, having that wanting to fight it and wrestle with it. But like there's that place where you can do that and expand and understand what it is to be more human and understand different pieces of the story. And because you do it sort of with the human part in mind, you're hoping that stops you from dehumanizing the other.
That's a really good point.
And so that it's not about being right or winning a war or being on the right side of history necessarily. But there's that willingness of like, this is what I believe, and I have a strong sense of it, and I want to share that. But I also want to understand what other people are saying, and where we can kind of come together and find a better sense of what is more ultimately true, good, and beautiful.
And I really like what you just said about the dehumanizing, or the like, that aspect that is always kind of a danger. That kind of gave me an insight that that's kind of the problem with the more individualistic tendency, that if you're sharing your feelings individualistically, and that's not something you might notice, like it's something you might look back on years later and see like, oh, I was actually just sharing them to vent just for myself, kind of. But if you're doing it in this context that we're talking about right now, that like, then you realize like, okay, now I'm precisely not dehumanizing other people. I'm actually seeing them for who they are. So I'm seeing how they also really have profound issues, and how we are sort of related to each other and can heal together, which is much more difficult if if you're so how should I say it, like if you're so closed off inside your own cognition or feelings, that the only reality that is happening is sort of what's happening for you, and therefore you're basically dehumanizing everyone else. Even though you think it's important to listen to their feelings, you won't really get there because you're not actually investing in a proper context that can then maybe be the intellectual or philosophical or religious part that gives an account of why you are both human beings, you know? So I think that's a really important aspect, what you just bring up.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. We've had lots of conversations offline, not recorded, but often you talk about this this desire to see Estuary make more space for the non-theist side of these experiences, and I have a similar desire to see that too. Do you want to kind of explain why that is, and what your hope with that is to give that space for maybe a non-religious minded person?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Or I can
Give it your best shot.
Yeah, exactly. To me, what I'm noticing is that in some sense, I feel like now that I'm sort of becoming reinterested in Christianity again, and not just Christianity, but Christianity among other things, is that I'm realizing how thankful I can even be for sort of the Christian background that I had, and even friends of mine and family members of mine who no longer closely identify themselves with the Christian faith. I can see what it has meant for many of them, and I can kind of see that has been given them a benefit, which, for instance, when they then start to go into like later phases of life, like when they start thinking about marrying someone, maybe, you know, raising children or something like that, you can kind of tell that those questions, they naturally come back. Obviously, you'd prefer if they come back before that, and they can also sort of, you know, really enjoy all the joys of it in the years before that, for to sort of to see what they can be part of outside the context of, oh yeah, I'm going to be raising kids, so therefore they should be getting good morals or something like that, you know, that it can be richer than that. But having said that, I can see that there is sort of a natural system or inclination there, that they are already benefiting from their background. And then what I see is that, especially because I've kind of been part of it, this much more non-theistic environment, which, to be fair, like, this is also good for I guess American viewers to know, is like the Netherlands is just a very like secularized country, so it is mostly just a non-theistic environment. And also, like in Dutch, we use the word nuchter, which kind of means very sober. And we have this saying in Dutch, like, just act normally, because that's strange enough for us already, you know, like, so we're prepared, you know, just like all the spiritual talk, just leave that aside, because like that's strange. Just act normal, and then we'll accept you. Which kind of shows that it's very difficult to even open up. Like, let's say that if someone starts taking up meditation, even that is already kind of like, okay, you know, like, sure, you know, you do you. Whereas in other contexts, that is accepted, like, oh, super normal, you know, like, obviously,
Yeah, like, oh, great.
yeah, exactly, great, so much fun. But now it's kind of like, yeah, I know it's a bit embarrassing, but I'm meditating. It depends on the context, like where you share that, obviously. But my point is that I can tell that there's this desire for the non-theistic community to find meaningful ways into these types of contexts, which do not necessarily have to be the church. They can also indeed be the estuary space, which is not the church, to then start having these conversations, because they don't have anything else. They don't have this sort of this background where they can sort of rely on and always sort of go back to. It's like they're really dependent on people inviting them in. But I also know that, you know, if people from the church invite them in, that will rarely ever go well, because that's too radical. Like that's way too much of a change. But they many of them love conversations, and this is kind of why I find it very, and this is also because of my own experience. So like, I'm a teacher, and I obviously teaching philosophy, you barely I don't know, that's maybe not obvious, but I'm barely teaching any religious individuals. I'm mostly teaching, that's also because I'm teaching in the Netherlands, like a very secularized context. And I can tell that it wouldn't help them out at all if I would start to be apologetic, which I'm also not inclined to do. Much more interesting if I start to give them like a spark of wonder, like that they can just start hesitating a little bit, like, wait, what if everything that I thought about the world could be different? And which opens this space of flow where it's like, okay, now I'm open to like some persuasion on, maybe there being something else. And that can be very vague. And again, like from that, they can go into psychedelics or Buddhism. So like that's also possible. I'm just saying like that I really, I appreciate creating that space far more, because that's also a space that many people that have gone to church are also passionate about, because they, at least, especially in the Netherlands, I think many people with a Christian background, they feel closer to many Islamic people. So the Netherlands is quite a huge part of the population is increasingly becoming Muslim, because they have larger families and they've immigrated to the country. And you can kind of tell that for some, at least, like there's a closer proximity, because at least you feel like you're both, you both believe in something more. Even though you disagree about the theology and those aspects, but that is different from when you talk to someone who you'd feel ashamed to even bringing up sort of this religious or spiritual interest of yours, because that's like what I said, like you should be nuchter, you should be acting normally. So this is like, again, I'm still giving it a shot, because I can tell that I don't have like a clear-cut conclusion. I'm just saying like I can tell that it's a bigger task to open up those spaces, and I feel that that's a responsibility, because I think that they might it might be much more useful to them than it might be to people from inside the church, to whom it's obviously also useful. So
well, I mean, even in America, the secularism is rising. And even sort of this sort of cultural Protestantism, which we used to see more as like, oh, that's a Catholic thing, you're culturally Catholic. But no, there's very much this increasing movement of cultural Protestantism, of someone who might identify as a Protestant Christian, but they don't, how much do they believe it? They don't really practice it. Like, it's sort of a question mark. But like, it's interesting living in, well, I grew up in this sort of very insular bubble where 21 years of my life, I had exposure to non-religious people. I had friends who were non-religious, but majority of my community was, Christians who believed similar enough things to what my family believed to keep that protection. You go out and you live in these more progressive secular cities and you have these conversations. And, I just realized it's not that people don't want to have these conversations. Like you can sit in bars for hours talking about religion, philosophy, like really deep, like back and forth conversations that are not fights, that are not divisive, like that are very meaningful and helpful. But the minute you say, oh, well, would you want to come to church? No. It's like, well, and like I think after going through deconstruction, it's like, fair enough. I get why it's not like appealing. And sometimes it's not appealing to me to go into church. Like I have to fight with some of those things, but there was that trust in it that I was like, well, I can't, like, it's better than not going. Right. But yeah, I think there's two sides of me that really like to see it. One, it was sort of that realization that, well, people really do want to have these conversations. And there's a place for that, but they don't want to be someone's project. And that's what often happens, especially in more evangelical minded places. You'll have those conversations and you'll entertain it to a point where you think someone's receptive. And then if you don't really think that they're receptive enough, you kind of have to move on to people who are more receptive, who are going to convert to your religion and your church. And, that's, you can understand that in a sense. But then there was that also this part of me that was like, well, I share and talk about religion, not because I want to convert people, although I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with, someone wanting to change someone's mind to something good, especially if it was good for them. But, if you don't believe that your religion relies on your works to save you, I'm not counting numbers of how many people I convert. In fact, I think it becomes a little tricky when I start doing that, because then it becomes a pride thing for me. It's like, I want to be friends and have these conversations with this person independent of whether they ever become a Christian or not.
Yeah.
And so, estuary spaces made it that place where you could have that interaction without it feeling like, oh, I'm trying to sneak you into
Oh yeah,
my
exactly.
religion.
Yeah.
But like you could still have those conversations. The second part was, it was like I was having these conversations with non-religious people, and they had so many interesting, beautiful, true things to share. And as much as I think church can be beneficial for people, I
Yeah.
think having that perspective from outside the church can be beneficial for the people in it too, because
Mm.
you get this deeper sense of
Great.
the wholeness of reality and what's actually going on in the world. And so how do you get those spaces where those things can come together and not feel the tension, or like there's a bad faith game being played?
Yeah.
And it's kind of similar how you were talking about the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversations, where it was like unintentionally bad faith, where, I don't think either of them are coming into the conversation wanting to uh, not have a good conversation with the other or
Yeah.
belittle the other. Yet there was these different ideas and modes and participation and perception of the thing that they were talking about, that it inherently created this space where there was that tension, because Sam was very evangelical in the removal of religion,
Yeah.
and Peterson in some ways had this perspective of like pushing people towards it. And so with those
Yeah.
tensions in mind, it became harder, where Estuary, when it became that space where you had all of these different people diving into this curiosity in different stages of these journeys. Well, one, there wasn't as much ego in it because you're not coming up and representing yourself,
Yeah.
that people can come and write YouTube comments on, and use clips of your words to fight a
Yeah.
war that maybe you're not even in.
Mhm.
But two, there's just something a little more human about that, and that gradation of the experiences that people are all in. And like, I don't know, like, and it seems like you had a similar experience with
Yeah.
your sort of approach to Christianity. And I know you're still sort of moving back into it and trying to understand what that means for you. But like, the things that helped me become more confident in my faith were the conversations with the people who were radically against the things that
Yeah.
I was in, and being able to really listen to them, take their ideas seriously, and wrestle with that to get to a place where I could move on and try to like make sense of it as a whole.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, I
I
think that's
just
good.
think there's something so helpful about that.
Yeah, and that's kind of, so this is, I think I already sort of related that in a much less well put way when I said like that I was surprised to at some point when I was 16 encounter Christians who would be in for going out for a drink, like that, which is kind of just to show that I I was confronted by the idea that like, okay, there is actually, I should say, like there's basically the majority of life is happening outside of the church. And then I was like, so basically what's happening inside of the church is this. So I was very confused when, like I had sort of like a modal confusion almost, that it was kind of like, okay, but Christians, they're inside the church, but they're participating in the majority of life because, there was these Christian individuals who were going out for a drink. And that was like the first time it was sparked to me, like, okay, this is interesting to me. And again, like it sounds very hedonistic that you would want to get drunk or something like that. But I sincerely mean to say that it's like, okay, there is a connection between what's happening inside the church and what's happening outside of it. And that's when I got way more interested, like, okay, how can we indeed make the church appeal to like, the whole of life and not like the half of it or a quarter of it or a
Yeah.
tenth of it. And that's why I'm very interested in the estuary space, because I do feel that it has that space to actually discuss everything. And just to also briefly relate it to the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris thing, is that one thing that I will also think wasn't working there, which relates to estuary, in my opinion, is that Peterson always gets the complaint, the criticism that he is that he produces word salad, so like that he is unclear what he's talking about, which I mean, so I can usually follow him quite well, but I can understand why some people would think that. And I realized that it's the case because Sam Harris, and I will admit to that, is like he is even clearer, like he is far clearer, is sort of most of the time in what it means. But that's also because the more that I listen to Sam Harris, he only really talks about, this is gonna sound like an insult, but it's also a strength, like about fairly simple stuff. So like Sam Harris is willing to discuss very simple ideas and then therefore also discuss them very clearly. And Jordan Peterson, like he always goes to like these depths of like, okay, I can only say this about it because like this sort of the limits of my thought. I cannot say anything more, or so like he'll go in depth, and therefore he will also be less clear because those areas of life are so in depth that they don't allow clarity as much because they're simply ambiguous. Like they go so deep that they're not, monovocal or just that they would have a single meaning. And that's kind of what I also like about the Estuary, is like people have some kind of openness both to people inside and to outside the church, that like, okay, we're going to discuss things, and we're going to sort of trust the process. We're not going to trust that we're going to clearly lay out everything and we're just going to present the arguments that we're going to be super clear about, but actually like we're going to be discovering together where we can arrive at. And I think that spirit is very important. And that also reminded me of it. So I think those two dimensions are very relevant to what you were discussing.
Well, and I think what you're sort of recognizing too, and it's not that I think Sam Harris always talks about simple things, because religion itself is not a simple thing, but the way he can lay it out makes it feel like things are more simple. But there's more of it seems like there's more of a security in what Sam Harris believes in his own head versus Peterson, where that's sort of the difference too, where it's like Sam Harris is convinced that religion is the worst thing in the world and the best thing we could do is get rid of it. Whereas Peterson is like, well, it's not so simple, but you can feel that wrestling within him where he doesn't even want to say that he believes in God. Right? Because what does that mean? And it's like, on one hand, it can be frustrating because you're just like, come on, man. Like, let's ground down a little bit here. Like we can get to some sense of like what that word means. But if you can let yourself open to that wrestling and understanding the complexity of what it is to actually go through these journeys, and realizing, well, it's not so easy for everybody to say, I believe in God in the way that it was for me. You give a little grace in that place, where Sam Harris, he's got it in his head. He doesn't have those questions, and maybe he has more questions than he lets off, but that's sort of his persona, right? He's got it. Whereas Jordan Peterson, he always allows that space for more curiosity and saying, oh, well, we don't know. And I think that's really appealing, especially for people who have lost confidence in the thing that is handed to them or given to them, or that they argued very dogmatically for, which, I certainly in some ways had found myself in that camp. I'm like, it's like being an Orthodox Christian. I certainly have a belief in, a right, that a certain path can be better than another, or spiritual participation, or that certain beliefs are more true than others. Yet there's also that sort of realization that we're all in different paths in understanding like this ultimate story we find ourselves in. And there's something that I've heard a lot in the Orthodox Church, is like, we can't say where God isn't, but we can say where he is. And so we move to the things where we believe he is and hold on to those. And so who's to say that God isn't working out the salvation of someone else in this different way? And that wrestling, just like the wrestling that I did for a decade, that led me to, 30 years, that led me to here, isn't part of that like saving act of what God is doing in the world.
I see what you mean. And that's kind of, I guess, what I'm also trying to get at. And I guess in my own way, that's also why someone like Nietzsche to me is very interesting, because he is kind of this strange individual as well, where you can kind of tell like there is something like Christian about him. There's something like about him that you can tell like he is inspired, and he makes this explicit at a couple of passages. But then there's also something that is very destructive, and I find that space very interesting to kind of discuss. Like, what are what are safe, but also at the same time not so safe that they're not inspiring kind of areas to really discuss matters together. And yeah, I don't know, like so I always find that super interesting to really go in depth on precisely people who are asking the questions and who don't yet know the answers, which is indeed why I think what you just mentioned is so important, that you just kind of at least allow that space, that you're not asking someone like, okay, well, do you believe yes or no? Okay, yes. Okay, well then you're part of us. Or no, well then you're not part of us. Or then you are part of us. It's like, no. Let's just suspend the like answering the question, but let's talk about it. You know, it's just and that's, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, we can't help but like there's this instinct in us to like get those questions and put people in boxes. But like if we know anything from ourselves, we're not very good at being put in boxes. At least for myself, it's like I can look at all of these check marks that you could say about me, but I don't fit in well into any of the boxes you want to put me in. And so like, you know, that recognition and that humility in myself to say, okay, well, I'm a walking contradiction half the time. Like I can give people that space to like, you know, work through those things and not always feel like I have to correct them, but like kind of try to unpack it and learn it and understand how to make sense. And I think to growing trust with people before you jump in for the correction.
Exactly. And that's also what you're trying to create, right? Like these environments of trust. And that's also like to be like, because we discussed individualism earlier, it's a little like you can't counterbalance individualism simply by saying, you know, stop being individualistic or something like that. So like I think we all have to acknowledge that we're also, at least, you know, I can speak for myself, like I'm also a product of an individualistic era where I also find it difficult to fully commit myself to a box, you know, like where and that's why people like they're hesitant about their gender, about their religious identity, about all these sort of identities, their not national identity, like there's all these identities that they're unsure about and they don't want to be boxed in. And I think like that's problematic. Like we know all the problems that can arise from that, but you also need to work constructively with those conditions. And to work constructively with those conditions means creating a space where you can slowly, sort of really slowly indeed build trust, and then allow people to sort of feel that they can make the step to say like, okay, I am going to commit to this, or I'm not going to commit to this. And that's sort of that's the process.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. Well, I guess to wrap up, you're coming to the festival. Why don't you give a little bit of like a teaser of what you hope that you can bring there with your lecture? And obviously, you know, it's still probably in the works, but what are some of your ideas for Germany?
Yeah, right. No, that's it's a great question. Like I'm still sort of putting it all together, but my own writing has focused on the sort of the historical Nietzsche, and has tried to counterbalance the interpretation of sort of Nietzsche as this, I don't know, atheist who is very much sort of against religion. Like I find him to be a profoundly religious individual, and that's kind of, but I won't go so far as saying so he is therefore like a super Christian individual. Like no, he is also very like he describes himself as Dionysian quite often, so as like a different type of religion, you could say, and obviously he is interested in the person of Zarathustra, so Zoroastrianism. So there's all these different kind of religious traditions that he also finds very interesting to pull from. And that's been my research on him. But why I think I want to relate him to the estuary context is because I find that the spirit of Nietzscheanism is very rampant as well in our time. And I think specifically what I find interesting is that you have this fitness and healthist culture also happening online, and it's also happening in this podcast space, and often it's sort of intertwined. And even in someone like Jordan Peterson, it's intertwined because he's like all about the carnivore diet, and you know, like so it's very strange that sometimes you could tell that these obsessions with being like healthy, and you could see Peterson is a psychologist, so he's focusing on, you know, you should be a healthy individual, you should do this, you should do this, but then also kind of tending towards like, well, yes, but you should improve yourself so you can be there for your family, for your community, and all that. And that's why I know that I think Jonathan Rosen, he mentioned that one of his colleagues once made the comparison that Peterson is also somewhere in between Nietzsche and Christ. Sort of saying like you need to get away from the herd morality with Nietzsche, but then also with Christ, like, okay, yes, like it's very important that the logos becomes flesh, so he likes some principles, but he won't go all the way with Nietzsche to like a nihilistic attitude, and we won't go all the way with Christ to like community building and all that. So I find it very interesting, because you can see that there is just it's kind of strange, but like there's just this tendency for people to find the meaning in life in physical activity, to just kind of be like, okay, I'm going to become healthy, and if I'm healthy, I feel better again. And I think I'm going to have to make this argument carefully, and I won't do that here, but I'm curious sort of to make the argument that the spirit sort of Nietzsche is profoundly related to being like, okay, so there is no, like, God is dead, so what is still here? Well, material is still here, matter is still here, and my body is here, and I can experience stuff through my body. So if I need to become healthy, because Christianity can be a religion for those who are sick, so like he says all these awful stuff about Christianity. So there's a spirit of Nietzscheanism that is happening and inspiring kind of this whole fitness exercise movement to find meaning. And I think many of them will also at some point admit, like, yeah, it doesn't scale up at some point anymore. So I want to have that part of the discussion, because some of them will think a bit differently about it. And then you have sort of like the Christian side, which is also obviously very much about this revival of finding meaning in our time, but they find it difficult to deal with ideas that directly challenge them. And that's someone like Nietzsche is very interesting for them, because he very much attacks Christianity head on. So I want to kind of have this this conversation of like, okay, can we sort of have a constructive bridge between this Nietzschean physicalist healthism and sort of the more Christian, but also kind of walled garden almost way of not really allowing criticism against your way, and what are the, in what ways can we be constructive there, and in what ways can we sort of also should we impose limits, because it can also be dangerous. And I'm also gonna relate some stuff about Nietzsche's own life. I think he was himself profoundly torn between Christ and Dionysus, like when at some point he unfortunately had a mental collapse at the end of his life. So his last 10 years were spent in a mental asylum. And he when he first still wrote letters, when he just had his mental collapse, like they seem to be entirely gibberish. So it's like very difficult to make any sense out of it. But he signed half of them with Dionysus, and he signed half of them with the crucified. So it's very interesting that you can see that he himself seems to then say, even though he is obviously mentally unstable at this point, but that he is embodying this being so torn between sort of the Dionysian faith, which is all about suffering, but suffering in a way that is glorious, which very much exemplifies the healthism, fitness culture, or indeed like the Christian way, which is all about the victimhood and the self-sacrifice and trying to, but victimhood in the sense that you can sort of help each other. And for him, it was too much. Like, so you could tell that he should have had a limit of some sort. But I can also tell that there's some of it that has been, and it's no coincidence that someone like Peterson has been using Nietzschean arguments against atheism. It's kind of like, well, atheists are not realizing that actually if you go all the way, then your atheism itself is a branch of Christianity. That's also an argument that Tom Holland has made. So I kind of want to see if there can be something productive there. I'm not sure if that's entirely clear. It's just like some teasing.
No, and that's okay. And I mean, I'm sure you're going to have much more time to lay it out and express it. But no, it's very interesting. And I think too about this idea of like the physicalism that you're seeing of like, well, we do have very much sort of an aesthetic culture in the sense of like, how do you eat really well to look beautiful? How do you, how do we put on makeup, dye our hair, like put this sense of beauty and like preserve this physical attribute of youth? Yet there's, it's this one side of the coin. And being Orthodox now, where you sort of see, how I understand it is like we see the physical and the spiritual very linked. And that's
Yes.
why we do a lot of like physical traditions, like the fasting, like standing in prayer, like there's these things, because it's this reminder of like how these physical and spiritual things are linked. And yeah, I'm interested to see how you unpack that and sort of see how Nietzsche sort of separated this physical aspect from a spiritual, God being dead, and how, the extremes of where that could go. Because in some ways, if you look to the end of Nietzsche's life, it is the extreme case. And thank God not everybody ends up in the extreme case,
Which is
at
like,
least for their whole lives. But
no, I always have to tell people I'm not a Nietzschean myself. Like, I'm profoundly interested in his ideas, but I would not consider myself a Nietzschean at all, even though I think he has profound insights, and he has insights that I try to directly combine with my interest in Christianity. And I think in some ways they can go together. But no, I think you're right. And also, like what you mentioned, like the Orthodox faith, that's obviously something that he was not familiar with at all. Like, his father was a Lutheran pastor, so he came from this Lutheran background. So for him, it wasn't as embodied. And he really thought that was a problem, like that, like he could tell that religion, but also, let's say atheism, it's kind of been this disembodied reasoning. And therefore we're forgetting about the fact that we have a body that we need to take care of, that we should be healthy, that we like, and that's really important. That's more important than indeed reasoning why we should stay weak. Obviously you don't do that directly, but he said that subconsciously you end up being weak because of it. So yeah, that's definitely something I'd like to discuss.
Yeah. Well, and where do you think, how do you think those things link to Estuary, and where that might help? Do you have an idea, or?
Well, yes. So I specifically want to relate it to Estuary in the sense that I want to get a feel, because I don't know. It's going to be like a proposal, and I want to hear back from the audience and maybe other speakers what they think. Kind of like, how much of, how should I say it, like criticism, how much of a challenge do we allow? So like, what is a healthy disagreement, and when does it become unhealthy? And that's the thing, like there is elements in Nietzsche where it's very healthy, where it's like a healthy criticism of Christianity that can actually help to improve Christianity. At least that's going to be my argument. But at the same time, there's elements in Nietzsche which are profoundly problematic and are indeed related to the Second World War in a very perverse manner. And that's unfortunate. So I want to relate it to Estuary, because we're still figuring out who are the people that are going to be part of an Estuary, and we want to welcome everyone. But at the same time, what is the spirit in which we want to do that? Because you kind of want to say like exactly, like we welcome everyone, we welcome all perspectives, but at the same time, you do seem to agree on a certain spirit. So how far does that disagreement stretch, and where is it constructive, because we do think that this disagreement can be constructive, and where is it potentially problematic? So that's just a discussion that I want to open.
Yeah, because there has to be something unifying all the differences to make it sustainable, right? There has to be something, and that's why church works, right? You have all of these different people with all their different baggage and things, but there's this certain belief that unifies them and keeps them together. But with Estuary, it's not the idea, the belief. There has to be something else. So that'll be really interesting.
Exactly. And that's why like someone like Nietzsche was like, he was so torn in between these two positions that for him, he was not unified. Like, and that's why, he signed his letters like with both those aspects, because he, in some sense, deep down couldn't decide. He found it very difficult to properly decide. And I would also say that's sort of an extra dimension that I think is relevant for the Estuary. People know Nietzsche for his ideas, but what I do in my research, and I think that's appropriate with Nietzsche because he's so psychological in his attitude, is to relate Nietzsche the person. And that's also what we're trying to do in Estuary, is to say like, hey, okay, it's one thing to look at the ideas and they're very interesting, but try to see where the ideas fit into this person's life, and then look at the through line sort of between the ideas and the person, and then you actually find this very fruitful context for discussion, conversation, faith, and trust. Yeah.
Well, it sounds very interesting, and I'm looking forward to see it all fleshed out.
Me too. I'm curious how.
You'll be fine. I'm sure. I have all the confidence in you. Well,
Thank
any last words before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to say that it was an absolute joy to sort of be here on your podcast and to even though yes, you're right, like we've spoken offline a bunch of times, but it's also nice to sort of provoke new questions and new
Yep.
ideas in these types of conversations. And I wish you the best and hopefully to until very soon again. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's always lovely talking to you. And yeah, I'm excited to have this out and see what it sparks, but definitely excited to see you at the festival and get that time to participate there. So thanks so much for being here.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close with serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.